morning, good evening, whichever it is for you. What I'd like to do with this recording is to go back into the first part of the course and fill in the material that we skipped over, the material on the tobacco industry that we missed because of snow in January. And as I said to you before, tobacco, along with cotton, was one of the primary pillars of the great industrial transformation of North Carolina in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. So let's get the PowerPoint deck running from the beginning here, and we'll dive into the story. The story of the tobacco industry in North Carolina is largely a tale of these two men, two tobacco barons, Washington Duke and Richard Joshua Reynolds, who each built one of the largest industrial empires in the United States. If you want a sense of the scale, they did for tobacco what J.D. Rockefeller did for oil, or what Andrew Carnegie did for steel. Duke and Reynolds' business careers followed very similar trajectories, though they came from very different life circumstances. Before the Civil War, Washington Duke was a yeoman farmer. He owned about 300 acres of land in what's now Durham County, and he planted that land in wheat and corn and grew a bit of tobacco on the side to sell for ready cash. Duke served in the Confederate Navy, and at the war's end, like many yeomen, he returned home and faced the prospect of rebuilding his life from economic devastation. Now, R.J. Reynolds was another sort of character altogether. He was born in 1850, so he was too young to have fought in the Civil War. He was one of 14 children in a wealthy Virginia family that owned nearly 11,000 acres of land cultivated by more than 100 enslaved men, women, and children. That farm was located on the border of Patrick County, Virginia, and Stokes County, North Carolina. And Stokes County will come back and be a part of the story a little bit later. After the war, many of those people who had been enslaved by the Reynolds family, now emancipated, many of them remained on the Reynolds land. They remained there as sharecroppers who grew tobacco and made it into chewing plugs in a small workshop on the Reynolds farm. So when Reynolds entered the tobacco business, he did so in some ways with a leg up. He inherited that small scale manufacturing enterprise from his father and built it, as I said, into an industrial empire. So let's follow these two men through the late 19th century and into the early 20th, and we'll begin with Washington Duke. After the war, Duke dedicated most of his land now to growing tobacco. And like R.J. Reynolds' father, he built a small workshop on the farm. You see a reconstruction of it here. In that workshop, his sons and a number of black workers made smoking tobacco. They would spread dried tobacco leaves out across great tables made with a fine mesh screen. They would pound those tobacco leaves with sticks and then use the screen mesh to separate the pulverized tobacco from the dust and dirt that had come in from the field. And when that process was completed, they would package the tobacco into small linen bags for sale. They applied this label, and as you'll see here, Duke included a Latin motto on his tobacco labels, pro bono publico, for the public good, which has something of an ironic ring today, given what we know about tobacco smoking. Well, in 1873, Duke picked up and relocated to nearby Durham, which was becoming an important tobacco manufacturing hub, largely because of its connections to that growing railroad network that we saw a little earlier in the course. There were more than 2 dozen tobacco firms there, including the W.T. Blackwell Company, which promoted its Bull Durham brand of smoking tobacco with advertisements painted on the sides of buildings all across the United States and in many places abroad. Signs like these. They actually painted one on the side of one of the pyramids in Egypt. And if you are baseball fans and you've been to Durham for a game, you know that the team is called the Durham Bulls. And whenever one of those team members hits a home run, this bull snorts sort of fire from its nose, and its eyes light up, and tail goes up in the air to celebrate that home run. So in 1873, Duke moved to Durham. He built a wooden tobacco factory. You see it there on the far right, and a home for himself nearby on the far left. And over time, he would replace that wooden factory with a grand brick factory and also quite a grand residence for himself. This is the Duke home a little bit later in the story. Both are symbols of the enormous wealth, representations of the enormous wealth that Duke was accumulating. Now, what set the Dukes apart and enabled them to dominate the smoking tobacco business was a willingness to experiment with both a relatively new product, the cigarette, and also with new manufacturing technology. Actually, the initiative came from Washington Duke's son, James Buchanan Duke, or Buck Duke, as he was known. Cigarettes had been popular in Europe for some time. They caught on in the United States during the Civil War. And Duke's real innovation that gave his family a competitive edge in the industry was technological innovation. Innovation that replaced human cigarette rollers with new mechanized uh, cigarette manufacturing, cigarette rolling machines. And as you can imagine, this allowed them to increase the volume of what they could produce and also to reduce the cost of producing those cigarettes. This technological innovation created a profound competitive edge. In 1884, the Dukes bought a prototype cigarette rolling machine from a young Virginia inventor named James Bonsack. They brought Bonsack and the machine to Durham. They perfected it, and once this machine was perfected, it could, in one machine in a day, could produce as many cigarettes as 48 human cigarette rollers, like the women you saw in the earlier image. So what happened in this machine is tobacco is loaded into the large hopper there you can see on the top. It's fed into the machine, and through this kind of amazing mechanism, the tobacco is rolled in paper, and out the other end come perfectly rolled, perfectly consistent cigarettes. Now, the Duke's other great innovation was their experimentation with what we would recognize as modern advertising. That is advertising that connects a consumer product with desire. If you went back to the late 19th century and look at newspapers, you'll see lots of advertisements, but they tend to be simply lists. An announcement that Joe Smith's store has the latest in women's hats and men's jeans and boots and so on. But advertising changed in the late 19th and early 20th century. As I said, creating what we do recognize as modern advertising, advertising that links desire to a commodity product. I mean, here's one example. Patek Philippe watches a sign of the status you've achieved in life, and a means of passing that status on to the next generation, generation after generation after generation. Or think about the way in our world all sorts of products are connected to sexual desire. In this case, of all things, bottled water. Well, what Buck Duke began to do was all those cigarettes, now produced at a lower cost by the Bonsack machine, he packaged with trading cards, collectible cards like these of scantily clad women. And you can imagine the appeal to male smokers. Here are some other examples. In some ways, you can think of this as late 19th, early 20th century soft pornography. But it had great power to sell the products, the Duke's cigarettes. Well, these innovations positioned the Dukes to dominate the tobacco industry. In 1894, there had been 253 tobacco factories in North Carolina, independent tobacco factories. 10 years later, only 33 were left, and all of them, each and every one, was a subsidiary of the Duke's American Tobacco Company, which controlled more than 90% of the American market for cigarettes. And what you have in the backdrop here is a share of stock in the Duke's American Tobacco Company. And as you know, the Dukes immortalized themselves by founding a university. Actually, what they did is they, in the late 19th century, bought a tiny college known as Trinity College. They bought it, it had been located in Randolph County. They bought it in 1892, and they moved it to Durham. And it would become what is now Duke University's East Campus. And here you see Washington Duke presiding over that section of Duke University. And then several decades later, they built West Campus, a Gothic cathedral, a Gothic university in a tobacco manufacturing town. And here is the statue of James Buchanan, Buck Duke, presiding over that grand expansion of Duke University. Now, one of the firms the Duke swallowed up was the R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. In 1874, so at about the same time that Duke moves to Durham, in 1874, when he was just 24 years old, Reynolds left home and moved to Winston. What's now Winston-Salem didn't become Winston-Salem with a hyphen until 1913. He moved there to build a new factory and to expand and transform his family's farm-based business. He was attracted to Winston because, again, it was tied into that railroad network we saw growing in the late 19th century, and also because it was in the middle of what was known as the Brightleaf Tobacco Belt. Now, Brightleaf tobacco was a variety developed in the late 1830s up in Caswell County and just next door in Stokes County. And it was produced in curing barns. So the tobacco would be harvested, it would be strung up on poles. Those poles would be put into a barn like this. They would be hanging from high up in the rafters. And then there would be a small smoldering fire at the base of the tobacco barn. And the heat, as it rose through, would dry, would cure the tobacco. And the combination of that slow drying and the minerals that came from the clay soil of the Brightleaf Belt produced a very sweet, pungent tobacco that was in some ways perfect for manufacturing into chewing plugs. And this method, as the roadside marker I showed you just a couple of slides back, was invented in sort of late antebellum era by an enslaved worker on tobacco land in this part of North Carolina. And you can see why it's called brightleaf tobacco. There are great mounds of the tobacco in a warehouse awaiting buyers um, from Reynolds, from Duke, and other tobacco firms outside of North Carolina. And if you go driving through the countryside in much of North Carolina, you'll see the markers of this industry. Most of these tobacco barns today are abandoned, but they are there now as a kind of remnant of an older economy. Much less tobacco is produced in North Carolina now because the federal price supports ended more than a decade ago. But what tobacco is produced is today cured in automated systems that about the size of a house trailer with a computerized system, gas-fired heat that mechanizes what would have been the very sort of tedious work of maintaining just the right level of drying in one of these earlier tobacco barns. Now, like the Dukes, Reynolds opened his factory in Winston using labor-intensive hand production methods, but he too began to experiment with new technology, particularly a machine known as the Adams duplex tobacco press, which was invented back in 1889. So this is an example of the packaging of some of R.J. Reynolds' tobacco plugs, chewing tobacco plugs that were made, as I said, with this machine, the Adams duplex tobacco press. And you can see why it's called duplex here, right? So on each side, it's taking in tobacco. You can see the kind of gate on the front that rises, that compresses the tobacco. And what this does is it produces the perfect chewing plug, consistently formed size and shape and weight, one after another by thousands. And again, it created a huge economy of scale for Reynolds. In a day's time, one machine could process a ton of tobacco, a ton of tobacco. That was more than the total capacity of his original human workforce. Now, the Dukes bought out Reynolds in 1898, but allowed him to continue running his business independently so long as he agreed not to compete in the production of cigarettes. That agreement held until 1911, when the U.S. Department of Justice broke up the Duke's monopoly, broke up the American Tobacco Company, broke it up into now 5 independent firms, one of which was a resurrected R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company. And I show you this picture. You'll certainly recognize Camel cigarettes. You'll know some of that history there. One of the most successful brands in the history of the tobacco industry. Reynolds, as soon as his firm was independent again, switched from chewing plugs to producing cigarettes in order to sort of give the Dukes a run for their money. And on that basis, as I said at the beginning, built one of the great industrial empires of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And not to be outdone by the Dukes, the Reynolds family bankrolled the, the move of a college, a new university of their own. They did this in 1956. They bought a small college, Wake Forest College, named after the town of Wake Forest, north of Raleigh. They bought that college, moved it to Winston-Salem on a brand new campus, and now renamed it, dubbed it Wake Forest University. So if you've ever wondered why that odd match between Wake Forest and the town of Winston-Salem, well, those are the origins of Wake Forest University. So if we step back from this story for a minute, we can see immediately an important difference between tobacco and textiles, between the tobacco industry and the textile industry. Um, the textile industry, as you've read in Like a Family, was characterized well into the 20th century, was characterized by a large number, hundreds of small firms scattered all across the Piedmont section of the state. Great textile corporations didn't really begin to form until the 1920s, and even then, they represented only a small part of the industry. But tobacco manufacturing, on the other hand, was highly concentrated, almost from the outset, highly concentrated in the hands of a few monopolistic firms. Just to give you a sense of that, this is an aerial photograph of Durham and the Duke Tobacco, the American Tobacco Company, and a similar drawing, a bird's eye view of downtown Winston, and you can just see the scale of the R.J. Reynolds enterprise there early in the 20th century. Now, tobacco also differed from cotton manufacturing in another important way. Unlike the cotton mills, tobacco factories employed a significant number of black workers. And in fact, these were the only factory jobs open to black North Carolinians in any meaningful way. And so at first glance, that might seem to have been a striking exception to the hardening segregation of the late 19th and early 20th centuries as we move into the era of Jim Crow. But in fact, this was an exception that, in a way, proved the rule, one that actually reflected a hardening racial dividing line. And here's what I mean. Tobacco manufacturing, unlike cotton textile production, was not fully automated until the mid 20th century. And in particular, the process of removing the stems, the hard stems from the tobacco leaves, removing all the field dirt from those leaves, it continued to be done by hand. It was dirty, undesirable work. It was work that white people saw as a natural extension of field labor and, and thus refused to do that work. And in the eyes of white North Carolinians, this was work suited to the descendants of slaves. So as a result, tobacco companies hired white workers to run the cigarette and plug making machines, and they employed black workers in much less desirable, low paying work. Men would have worked in warehouse jobs, as you see here, and women would have worked in the stemmeries. So what these women are doing is they're picking up the dried tobacco leaves, they're pulling the hard stem out of the center, right? Preparation, cleaning the dirt off, preparation for the manufacturing process. And when these women left the plant at the end of a 12-hour day, their clothes would have been stained yellow by the gooey sap that oozed out of the tobacco leaves. That sap would have collected much of that field dirt as they cleaned it off. In oral history interviews, many of these women remembered their jobs in pretty stark, realistic terms as sticky, nasty work. But even those jobs paid better than life as a sharecropper, which is why thousands of black families migrated off the land in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century, migrated to Winston, migrated to Durham to find work in the tobacco factories. Winston, early in the 20th century, its population was 40% black. And this aspect of the tobacco industry uh, is one of the reasons that large concentrations of Black population in North Carolina, outside of the eastern coastal plain, those populations are centered in Durham and in Winston-Salem. Black workers lived in harsh conditions in these cities. They were forced into segregated neighborhoods where housing was cheaply built by white landlords, white slumlords, um, to be more precise. Well into the 20th century, many of these homes didn't have running water. They were outfitted with backyard privies rather than indoor toilets. Those privies often emptied into open ditches that bred diseases such as typhoid fever, dysentery, hepatitis. As you see, streets were unpaved. They were dry and dusty in the summer and almost impassably muddy in the winter. Um, and this is a picture of one of those neighborhoods in Durham in 1964, so not that long ago. Now, looking back on these conditions, it's easy to fall into the trap of seeing Black tobacco workers simply as victims of forces beyond their control. And of course, there's some measure of truth in that, but there's also much, much more to this story. And this part of the story I want to unpack for you now is going to become very important for us later in the course. The Black neighborhoods of Durham and Winston offered these farming families off the land, they offered them an escape from sharecropping, a release from lifelong labor behind a mule, and they provided a meaningful distance from the authority of whites. In neighborhoods like those in Durham, like Durham's Hayti neighborhood, you see the image here. It is a community that was later bisected and much of it destroyed when it was time to do uh, highway building through Durham and what was called in the 1960s and 70s urban renewal. Right, you saw again here the imprint of Jim Crow. The neighborhoods, the communities that were sacrificed were Black communities. Often people said that urban renewal was in fact, as critics put it in the 1960s and 70s, it wasn't urban renewal, it was Negro removal, to use their words. Now, but in neighborhoods like Durham's Hayti district, Black residents built churches that became focal points of vibrant community life. And they also built other institutions, such as the National Religious Training School, which today is known as North Carolina Central University. And as we'll see in the second part of the course, they invented their own musical tradition, known as the Durham or Bull City Blues. And these large urban concentrations of Black population also supported Black-owned businesses and gave birth to a Black middle class of merchants, doctors, preachers, teachers, and lawyers. Durham's Parish Street was known well beyond the borders of North Carolina as America's Black Wall Street. It was the home to Mechanics and Farmers Bank, founded in 1908 by Dr. Manasseh Pope, a Raleigh physician. He founded that bank along with a small group of Black businessmen. And this bank was important because it made small loans to Black customers um, who white banks refused to serve. And it helped many families build homes and educate their children. Mechanics and Farmers Bank was also closely associated with the North Carolina Mutual and Provident Association, which later became the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company. Here, the longtime president, a little bit later in the story of Mechanic and Farmers Bank, was John Hervey Wheeler. He's going to become important again when we look at the war on poverty in the 1960s. And if you're interested in this part of the story, I commend to you this book, John Hervey Wheeler, Black Banking and the Economic Struggle for Civil Rights, um, written by Brandon Winford. There on the right, Brandon was one of my doctoral students a number of years ago, now teaches at the University of Tennessee. Well, as I said, Mechanics and Farmers Bank was also very closely connected with the North Carolina Mutual and Provident Association. The company was founded in 1899, and in the early 20th century, it grew to become the largest Black-owned business of the United States. It got its start selling burial policies to poor Black families for whom the death of a loved one could be financially devastating. The mutual sold policies to clients who paid 5 or 10 cents a week for $100 worth of funeral coverage, enough to pay for a basic funeral, uh, a funeral cost that otherwise could literally bankrupt a family. As I said, this company later became the North Carolina Mutual Insurance Company. Um, Photographs there on the left of its headquarters a bit later in the 30s, 40s, and there on the right, its headquarters built in the 1960s. The building on the right, you can see as you take the freeway through Durham. The North Carolina Mutual, though, did close and cease business a number of years ago. Durham's Haytie district was also home to the Carolina Times, one of the South's most influential Black newspapers. It was edited by Lewis Austin, a crusading journalist, an outspoken leader in the long struggle for Black civil rights. Um, Lewis once explained his sort of principles as an editor. Our eternal goal must be equality, he said. We will teach it and thunder it until every Black person achieves it. And again, if you want to learn a bit more about Lewis Austin and the Carolina Times, I'd commend this book to you, uh, written by Jerry Gershenhorn, there on the left. Jerry, too, was one of my former doctoral students and recently retired, actually, from teaching in the Department of History at North Carolina Central. Maybe that's a message for me. In any case, my point in all of this is that for Black North Carolinians, the rise of tobacco manufacturing cut in two ways. On the one hand, it bore all the hallmarks of a system of hardening segregation and racial injustice. What we'll soon examine is the regime of Jim Crow. But on the other hand, it also planted the seeds of that system's eventual destruction. It did so by creating communities and institutions and leaders at the forefront of the long, ongoing struggle for civil rights. That, of course, is a story for another time. It's one that we'll return to a bit later in the course. Well, that's a quick view or overview of the tobacco industry in North Carolina. Um, I hope you found it interesting, and I will see you in class soon.